Hello everybody, this is Manu S and welcome to another Eternal Contenders video series. While it is currently pretty hard to actually break the format and find a deck that really crushes ladder in my experience, I've been trying a lot of things and they all feel like kind of okay and do reasonably well, but yeah, it seems really tough to find a deck that crushes ladder as hard or does as well as decks in the past. I've provided a lot of decks that just completely destroyed ladder at the time that I found them and revealed them to my viewers, but lately this has been really tough. But there's still a fair share of solid playable decks out there to share, and also especially a lot of oldies to update with the new set, and there is a fair share among those that are still very reasonable and solid decks to play on ladder and even in tournaments. And today I got one of those for you. It's time to update the unnamed or the unofficial tournament king of pre-D Dusk Road tournament, which is Combrei Party. It was mostly embraced by our team Eternal Titans, but we have basically been tearing up the tournament scene with it before the Dusk Road dropped, and the deck has always been at least a solid choice on ladder, even though not remotely as strong and dominating as it was in tournaments for the time we played it, and the deck still is pretty good. One of the things that holds it back a bit is that the Argenport midrange matchup is a bit unfavorable and a bit wonky. It's not terrible, but it's not favorable either, which is a bit problematic in today's world, keeping the deck from being as much of a top tier deck as it used to be, basically. Alright, without further ado, let's look at the new Combrei Party list as we played it in the last Team League, among others, with some minor changes since then. Alright. Okay, so this is the deck. The deck got a bunch of sweet upgrades, the main one being Trailmaker. Losing Amber Acolyte for Trailmaker speeds up the deck nicely and gives it some more power draws, basically. It makes Obelisk better, it makes Kothon's ultimate better, it makes Siraf better. It gives you more to do on turn 2, since so far we have 8 2-drops, so sometimes you might not have something to do on 2. Playing a Trailmaker is nice, and it also makes it more likely to drop a turn 3 Titan in the matchups where that's great, and still fixes your colors really well, arguably even better than Amber Acolyte, simply because it doesn't need, for example, a second Primal Sigil to provide a second Primal, and also doesn't reduce the outs to draw the color that you're fixing and so on. So there's a couple of nice upsides here. And like I said, it is really nice with Obelisk, getting to Obelisk threshold earlier. The other change is that we are currently running some Amelie Cloudmarshals. That was an idea that Zarius suggested when we talked about updating the deck a bit. Trailmaker was kind of the obvious addition that we both immediately saw and agreed and independently implemented. I was basically questioning the Crystallizes with so little time midrange, and Crystallize just not being that well positioned of a card right now. But my more obvious idea at first was World Bearer Behemoth, which seemed decent, it has synergy with Student. It can get the 6 power for Kothon's ultimate if you don't draw it naturally, and it accelerates and solidifies Siraf activation, but all in all it's a bit underwhelming. A 6/7 is kind of a random body without evasion, and the attack trigger, the land fetching, is pretty marginal and depends on other cards to be good. It mostly is good with Obelisk, and only until you hit the Obelisk threshold, any land that you get afterwards does nothing, and it's kind of the same with Siraf, and Students' synergies are also kind of marginal. So yeah, initially I didn't think Amilli was supportable and thought it might be a bit greedy, but when Sarius brought him up and was more optimistic about him, I checked the color requirements a bit and was like, yeah, it's actually much more reasonable, and if we lose the double blue for Crystallize, it should be almost as supportable as a World Mirror Behemoth in the end. And yeah, we tried it out, works pretty well. Card is much stronger on his own. He can basically just take over a game entirely on his own unanswered. He has great synergy with Obelisk and Stand Together, buffing up the army that he creates. So it's just another one of these individually powerful cards like Siraf or Kothon and stuff like that that can take over a game by themselves, but also synergizes nicely with some of the other cards in the deck, which is exactly what the deck is basically about. A bunch of strong individual cards that get even better together and can still take over games on their own, and also adds another power draw to the deck, because you can go Initiative Descent into Trailmaker, into Amelie on turn 3, which is super powerful. And so far Amelie has been testing pretty well. And yeah, Crystallize is something that you need this rarely these days, usually, that we would at best run it in the sideboard. For Team League last time we chose to not run it at all, which may or may not have been right. Going forward I might end up putting 1 or 2 in the sideboard, but that only matters to people that play tournaments anyway. And yeah, the rest is just some nice updates to the power base. Basically, Crest of Wisdom is good enough that I wanted to try and fit it in, especially because the deck has a fair share of spots in the curve where it can afford to play a Crest. And yeah, I managed to fit in 3 Crests. The time sources are a bit low for turn 1 initiate. They are at 14, but between like factoring in redraws and stuff and the deck not always needing initiate on 1, 14 is still an okay number. Like, if you really reliably want your initiate on turn 1, I would recommend sticking to 15 or ideally 16. That's like the kind of perfect amount, but 14 in a 3-faction deck that isn't super dependent on having it turn 1 all the time, and also has only one drop, is pretty fine. Like, the 16 turn 1 sources become much more important if you run like 8 fire 1-drops in aggro decks, where also having a 1-drop on turn 1 is absolutely crucial. But yeah, the 14 seem okay. That allowed for 3 Crests, and going back down to 1 Primal Sigil definitely helped a bit with making the deck overall a bit more stable, and also yeah, making the deck less tear into different directions early on. Diplomatic steals still seem necessary in the deck for initiate and also for early flexibility with the different 2-drops and the Enforcer on turn 3 into Titan on turn 4 stuff. And yeah, the rest of the deck is mostly the same. We basically cut the one-off Eileen's Choice that we were running towards the end to fit the 4 Trailmaker, because we cut 4 Acolytes, and I think it makes sense if you cut 3 Amber Acolytes, which provide a hard power source that cannot be silenced or killed, that if we replace them with Trailmakers, that it makes sense to replace them with 4 Trailmakers, because the Trailmakers, while they are cheaper and more powerful, they are also more fragile, and you really, really don't want to be power screwed because they kill your Trailmaker or not get anything out of the acceleration. So that's why we didn't cut a power source for the 4th Trailmaker and rather cut a situational role player card. For the Team League we had 2, I think, Protect in this slot and 4 Vanquish, but that leaves the deck a little light on answers, and the Protects were an attempt to like help against Argenport, but I'm not sure if they are like good enough at helping there, and the additional Marshals are actually kind of nice against Tavrod and all the flyers in Argenport to keep them from racing and pressuring us and making it easier to sort of stabilize and stall out the game and then win in the late game, because our late game is much more powerful than theirs. We basically just have to keep them from running us over most of the time when tempoing us out, and Marshal does a surprisingly good job there, also giving the deck 10 virtual answers to the problematic part of Tavrot, which is his trigger. If it's just a 5-7, it's fine. It's just going to make the game stall out, which is something that we are good at anyway. So I kind of went back to the Marshals, even though it's a bit heavy on the 2-cost cards now, but then again, with Initiate and Trailmaker, the deck can often go 2 2-cost cards on 4 power, for example, or like a 3-cost and a 2-cost card on 5 power and so on, and take good advantage of the ramping. So that is not that big of a concern. And yeah, Permafrost is just more narrow and also doesn't deal with Tavrot. Like if you replace the Desert Marshals with Permafrosts like I did for a bit, then that's nice against units, but it's kind of bad against control, and it's bad against Titan and Tavrot, while silencing an opposing Titan when we don't want to have one of our own can actually be pretty relevant with our flyer sub-theme to just kind of beat them in the air. While if we have a Permafrost there, we can't do anything, we're just like sitting there and staring at each other. Marshal is just a more flexible card and a reasonable threat still with Stand Togethers and Obelisks, and also nice against some of the killer effects and relic weapons. It's just a very versatile card, even though it's becoming less and less impactful since the game gets faster and the cards become more powerful, and Marshal is just a bit weak in that regard. It's not a powerful card, it's just a very flexible card. But yeah, in the end, I think it's still the best card for the job and the slot for now. Also, against Reanimator and especially the Haunting Scream part, Desert Marshal is incredible, while Permafrost is much, much worse. If it helps at all, depending on how things go. Like if they just mill or discard their Haunting Scream target and scream it back, Permafrost's not going to do anything. Okay, that's it for the deck list. The rest is still the same as always. You can compare the power base a bit to the old one, shuffled a couple of things around, basically replaced the seats of Wisdom with 3 crests and I think a Sigil or a Hooru banner, not sure, and adjusted the power base a bit to make it as smooth as possible and still incorporate as many crests as we could. Okay, deck is still doing quite well on ladder just because it's proactive, powerful, and versatile. But yeah, as always, it's not the best ladder deck, but it's a very reasonable deck to play on ladder that's pretty well rounded, especially currently with decks like Reanimator and stuff going around. Okay, that's it for the deck tech. As usual, gonna hop into some games, show how it does on ladder. And yeah, stay tuned for the first game coming up next.